During the Democratic National Convention, there was a tribute to President Obama. And in that tribute, one of his advisors said a quote that struck me pretty deeply and really helped me kind of reframe or focus how I thought about my role as an educator. And that quote was, "Nothing comes to the desk of the president unless it's almost impossible, and he has to figure it out." And it made me think, what sort of education prepares people to take on almost impossible problems? Like, what would that education look like? And recognizing that every president of the United States came from our K-12 system, there could be a future president in your classroom. And so the thought experiment of, are they prepared to take on these almost impossible problems because of, in spite of, the experience they had in your classroom, or are they not prepared? So what is it about this ability to think about and take on almost impossible problems? I'd also add that the president is not the only one with complex work. Increasingly, there's demands on graduates in K-12 and higher education, in post-collegiate work, in career, as being a citizen. We are constantly engaged in really complex, almost impossible problems. And all you have to do is look at the newspaper, and you will see plenty of sticky and stubborn problems. Today, I signed on to CNN, Fox News, and NBC, and here are some of the headlines that I saw. And there are plenty of them. And each one of these represents a really sticky, stubborn, almost impossible problem. And I'm not using problem purely in the negative sense, but problem as some gap between where we are and where we could be. It could be an opportunity. So how do we actually prepare people to think about and take on these problems? I want to dig a little bit more into one of these problems. Does anybody have any idea of what this is a picture of? Yeah?
The Grand Prismatic Spring.
Okay, well that's more specific than I knew. Where is that?
Yellowstone?
Yes, yeah, so this is Yellowstone. And do you know why? Do you know why it's steaming?
Because it's hot.
It's hot. Yeah. There's a super volcano underneath this. Have you heard about these super volcanoes? Well, get ready to be a little bit afraid. I'm going to throw up some numbers. The super volcano underneath Yellowstone is pretty dramatic. 3 numbers here. The last time it erupted was 630,000 years ago. And when it did, it produced more volcanic material, molten rock, lava, 250,000 times more than Mount St. Helens. So that's the magnitude we're talking about in this super volcano. That's 250 cubic miles worth of material. If you were to spread that over the state of Indiana, that would level 50 feet in the air. So we're talking about a huge, huge amount of material. Now this is the scary part.
That wasn't the scary part.
Well, we're building here.
I'm there.
You're there? So previous estimates of when this would erupt were in the range of thousands of years into the future. New models, and they test kind of pressure, temperature, the chemical balance underneath the surface, have changed the time scale, and it could erupt as early as the 2030s. Have you all heard this? It's been in the news.
No.
Well, yeah, you haven't heard it because you've been like too busy looking at all this stuff, right? Again, the world is full of almost impossible problems. But what I love about this example is that some folks are thinking about this and figuring out how can we address this problem. Actually, a team from NASA that used to work on how do we protect the Earth from asteroids started working on this problem. Apparently they're tracking something like 98% of all asteroids near the Earth, and we're not in any danger in the next 100 or so years into the foreseeable future in terms of what we can track. So they started looking beneath us and realized that the threat beneath us is actually as great as the threat above, if not more. In fact, the NASA researcher seemed to be more concerned about this. But how do you address a problem like this natural occurrence? what's amazing is that this team is exploring possibilities of drilling down under Yellowstone. You don't think this is a good idea? Drilling down underneath cool water to cool the area and use that as a source of geothermal energy. Really cheap energy. So not only are they trying to address the problem by stabilizing the temperature and releasing some pressure, but creating an innovative way to provide energy. And some countries have already done this. And I love this quote. I'll put up the quote from this NASA researcher. Through drilling in this way, it could be used to create a geothermal plant which generates electric power at extremely competitive prices. So it's just like, it makes sense, it's economical. And then I love the last part of his quote. The long-term benefit is that you prevent a future supervolcano eruption to devastate humanity. Right?
Good going.
Right? Yeah, like twofer. So I think this is a great example of someone really immersed in their discipline, highly knowledgeable, which allows him and the team to create really thoughtful, creative solutions to otherwise overwhelmingly complex problems. And this is what I'm really interested in. How do people get there? How do we develop learning experiences to create more Brian Wilcoxes? And so the question is, what is the environment, similar to the soil that cultivates these plants to grow in certain ways, and the light and the moisture and the air? What is that analogous environment within a classroom, within a school, within a district, within a community? What's that environment that cultivates these types of creative problem solvers? Project-based learning provides some structure, some infrastructure to visualize what these learning environments will look like. And I think in order to do it well, at least three things need to be true. One is it needs to start with a really good question or a really good problem. Without that, it's just an activity. So it really needs to start with that good question or a good problem. It engages students in rich, meaningful intellectual work. And then finally, keeps authenticity at its core in role, process, and product. We'll talk more about this at the end, but I wanted to throw that out there so you all are thinking about these things throughout the experience this evening. So the agenda, we just went through this introduction. We're going to dive in, and you're going to experience about an hour PBL experience as a learner. That'll give us the context for which we can have a debrief and discussion about some of these elements that I think help contribute to this cultivation of creative problem solvers. So we're gonna kind of flip this now and transition to learner mode. And this isn't like I designed a project for fifth graders and you're going to pretend you're fifth graders. You all are learners. This is a real project, and I want you to engage as real learners. So I'm going to put up a screen, and I just want you to think about the questions that come to mind, the images that come to mind, the emotions that are elicited, and turn to a partner and just what comes to mind when I put this up there. Who thinks they know when they're being duped? Who's confident that they can spot fake news?
You're a journalist.
One of us? Well, let's test. Here's a graph. It's kind of small, so I'll read it for you. I found this somewhere today, this morning. So this red line is Trump. This was Obama. In his first, if you know anything about it, don't say anything. But in his first 10 months, Trump told nearly 6 times as many falsehoods as Obama did during his entire presidency. So on the bottom axis is time since inauguration, and this one's lies or falsehoods. The question that I want you to think in your mind is, do you believe this, and why or why not? Do you believe this, or why or why not? So just think to yourself, do you believe this, or why or why not? Just quickly checking with your partner. Try to take a scan. Do you believe it, or why or why not? What? Who believes it? Maybe 3, 4. Oh, okay, we'll put a few more. Who doesn't believe it? A few of us. What question do you want to know the answer to that would help you determine whether or not you believe it or not? What's a question people have? Yeah.
How is it quantified?
How is it quantified? Okay. What else? Yeah.
What's the source?
What's the source? Okay. I'm releasing more information now. Talk with your partner. Has your belief in the truthness of this changed?
Yes.
And if so, why or why not? Has it changed? Why or why not? Talk with your partner. Did anyone's opinion change? A few. There's one last thing that I have to reveal here. It's just a screenshot. One last thing. Watch the screen carefully. You're going to miss it. Ready? It's just a screenshot. It's just a screenshot. I didn't add anything. But talk to your group. Now, does this change anything for you? Does it change anything for you? Did that change anyone's mind? Make them more or less confident either way? Maybe? Yeah? It did? How so?
It made us less confident.
Made you less confident.
We were
So you-
curious about the idea of data within the context of somebody's.
Okay, so what more would people want to know?
What is a liar or falsehood to this person?
Okay, what's a liar or falsehood to this person? I would also just say that this wasn't in response to the article, but it is characteristic of a few of the tweets that the president is claiming that these news sources are spreading falsehoods. So here we have an article that claims one thing, an individual who claims the opposite. How do we figure it out? How do we figure out? What questions would we want to ask? What investigation would we want to conduct? A few people said, what constitutes a falsehood? Okay, so I'm going to scroll down in the article, okay? Here's a list. They listed the numbers that were on the graph. Okay, so here's the raw data. Well, here's some data. Okay? What question do we have after, so these are lies from January 21st to January 26th. This is the first year of Obama. They're quotes. Are people more convinced now or less convinced?
I want to know the definition, but also the methods through which these particular quotes were selected and all the other things they said were disregarded.
Okay, well, I'm gonna zoom in on this one. This is a link. Okay? So this is one of Obama's lies. You're not going to be able to read the whole thing, but are you more convinced or less convinced about this source? Anyone know this source?
Yeah.
You know who?
It's down the hall.
It's down the hall. Does this make you more? This is at University of Pennsylvania. Are you more convinced or are you less convinced? Right? And I guess the broader question is, do we need to do this every time? You know, like we're like, you know, this is one of the quotes of one of the sides, and there were between the two, you know, over 100, well over 100. So the question that is driving this discussion is, how do we know what is true? How do we think about things like this? Experiencing an article, experiencing a claim that someone makes, how do we know something is true? This is the driving question of this experience today, okay? So we're about to engage on a project with the driving question of how do we know if something's true? And we want to get better at being able to answer that question. How do we know if something's true? Now, the project expectations for the next 45 minutes or so is that you're going to create a 2-minute presentation that has a clear argument that addresses the problem I'm about to put up on the screen. You want to provide evidence that supports the claim, and that the argument, evidence, and presentation follows some norms and practices of a discipline. Different disciplines have different ways of making an argument. Scientists make argument in particular ways. Mathematicians make argument in particular ways. Social scientists make argument in particular ways. Follow the norms of some discipline when you're constructing this presentation that has an argument and evidence. Here's the task. McDonald's remains one of the world's largest restaurant chains, serving over 69 million customers daily in over 100 countries across approximately 36,900 outlets as of 2016. Your task is this claim reasonable? create a compelling argument to convince you and others that your answer is correct. You can't use the internet for the first 10 minutes. So in your groups, go ahead and begin. Okay, let's pause for a second. You're not done, you're not completely done working on it, but we are going to take a break to receive some feedback from peers. Let's just briefly talk, what does good feedback look like? What are some characteristics of good feedback? Yeah, a few questions that you can use to assess your feedback. Will the feedback help the group improve their work? If the purpose of the feedback is for improvement, saying things like, I really like that, or that's confusing, might not be as helpful as explaining it in a way that would actually help them improve or inform changes. And that also relates to specificity. And the other one that I want to add is, in the context of this round, it's tied back to the project expectations. And I want you to focus mainly on this argument and the evidence. What argument is the group making, and what's the evidence? And are you compelled or not, and why or why not? So focus your feedback on those two elements. Beyond the explicit feedback that your partner group provided, I also want you to consider the questions that they ask, as those might represent some things that weren't quite as clear about your presentation. Meet back with your group and think, what revisions do we want to create as a group? What do we want to change about our presentation for our final product? Before we go to presentations, can we just give each other a round of applause? The energy in the last 3 minutes was very exciting. Just walking around, there's a lot of excitement, or I don't know if excitement's the right word, but there was some energy going on. So good work. We're going to go through 3 presentations. I already told the groups that they're presenting. Keep in mind, you all are experts, or as close as the world comes to experts on this quote. Perhaps no one in the world has done as much work in the last, thinking about this quote. So I want you to use that to ask these presenting groups really good questions. Questions that force them to think more deeply about how they're making their own claim. Okay? I had a science teacher think about this problem. Because in science you can't prove anything definitively, but you can disprove things by finding evidence that go against it. And so maybe that's one way to think about this, can we find evidence, or the more and more evidence that we find that doesn't disprove this, might make us more confident in thinking that this might be reasonable. Whereas in law, there are different standards of proof, like clear and convincing, or a preponderance of evidence. And based on the use of the claim and what we're trying to use it for, we hold ourselves to different standards. So these are fields. And in math, which is my field, you can prove things, true or not true. In fact, it might be the only field that you could prove something true or not true. You can prove it. That's what we do in math. We make proofs. So these different fields are thinking about these questions in different ways, which is why I want you to think about in which discipline would your argument be convincing? Because different disciplines think about these things differently. A lot of it has to do with use and audience and purpose. Right. Thank you. What I really appreciate about this question, though, is that you're trying to put yourself in the role of these different disciplines, and you're thinking about how do philosophers think about this, and several of you thought about it in different ways, and you think about what are the features of a project or a task or an experience in a classroom that puts students in the position to have these conversations. I want to kind of pause on the project for right now and do some debrief about kind of the different elements of this. Before I do that, and I'll put this up here as the things that I'm going to debrief, but I want you just to check in with your group, debrief the experience. What are some of the features of the experience and the impact that it had on how you interacted, the things you thought about, the work you did? So features and impact. Just talk for a few minutes about that.
I think for me, it's good.
So I want to go through a few different things in the final 15 minutes or so that I want to call out as things that I thought were kind of significant or had some impact. And the first was the launch, which referenced as kind of setting the stage and contextualizing the question or the problem in something that is relevant, meaningful, interesting, or just providing some context. So if you recall, we talked about fake news, we looked at an example together, you had a chance to talk about why it was important to you, the emotions that came up, before we dove in. And had I just gone to the question, you might have experienced it slightly differently. So this idea of like setting the stage and getting people ready, like that need to know, like where is this going, what kind of question is bubbling up to the surface, is pretty classic in project-based learning and helps people find the relevance or the meaning within the project. The next was the essential question. The essential question was, how do we know if something's true? And I probably could have kept referring back to that more frequently, but that question that we put up right before the task is, all this conversation of fake news, and we talked about that one example from the New York Times, how do we know if something's true? And one of the characteristics I think of an interesting essential question is that the more you learn about that question, the more complicated the question becomes. So hopefully, the question of how do we know if something is true, you're thinking about it slightly more nuanced. Perhaps you're thinking more about it with respect to disciplines or context than you were before this experience. So it's kind of this, what is the essence of what we're trying to do, and what question captures that essence? Without a driving question or an essential question, sometimes it could just feel like a series of activities where you're just having people do work, but without something to tie it all together. So thinking about what is the essence, what is the kind of foundational or fundamental question that we're trying to address by doing the work that we're doing. Next aspect was sustained inquiry. So a big chunk of the time was you all working with each other, negotiating, defining terms, collaborating, doing your research, figuring out what questions that you had, and figuring out how you're making sense of the project and managing kind of the process of completing the product. The next thing, the creation of a product. From my experience, the creation of a product, having something definitive that you need to create, provides an extra layer of urgency and accountability to the work. And you're forced to be a little bit more rigorous or thoughtful about the conclusions you make when you're creating something. Because that allows for this process of feedback, reflection, and revision. So as throughout the course of you building something, taking a pause, getting feedback from another group does several things. One, it gets you better at giving and receiving feedback, which is generally an important skill. Two, it exposes you to other ideas in the room. So a lot of you had, I didn't think about it this way, or we were thinking about it this way, or we actually didn't use that source because of this. It engages groups in conversations across different kind of approaches to the problem, which can be helpful, and it helps you improve your product. And then the final aspect that I want to talk about is authenticity. And people use authenticity in several different ways. And I want to call it a few specific ways. One, which I think is probably the most commonly used, is like authentic to the student or the community. That the student sees that the work that they're doing is somehow meaningful, important, relevant to their lives. Many of you mentioned kind of emotional aspects of this fake news, or that you understand why it's important. So that's kind of the level of authenticity of student or community. The next one, though, role, process, and product. This is like, what role are you engaging in? What's the work that you're doing? And what's the product you're creating? And how authentic are those things? Classic example of project-based learning is like the paper mache volcano. A group of us were talking about this yesterday. And the role that the individual creating a paper mache volcano is that of like a paper mache like artist, right? Which is authentic to some community and the work that they're doing. They're arts and crafts specialists, and the product is a craft. but it isn't necessarily the community, the role, the process, the product that you might be intending. Are they taking on the work and the role of a mathematician or a historian or a scribe or a researcher or a fact checker or a scientist or a philosopher or a writer or a performer? What is the work requiring of them? And if the answer is student, you're requiring the role of student, the work of student, filling out a multiple choice test is really the work of a student, which means that it's authentic to students. But it might not be authentic to these broader communities. And this is where we can think of like the disciplines or fields, and do these things come together to create an authentic experience? Good project-based learning, like the highest forms of it, follow these criteria. They start with a really good question or a really good problem. It's got to be big enough, rich enough to enable these sorts of conversations to happen. It engages students in rich, meaningful, and intellectual work. And it keeps authenticity at its core, both in role, process, and product. And it's intentional about these things. This session was inspired by two separate articles that I've written. One was The Teaching of Future President, this idea of almost impossible problems. And the other is Finding What's True, a cross-disciplinary search for truth. I talked with a mathematician, a historian, a scientist, and a lawyer about how they define truth in their fields. And it was quite fascinating. So if you're interested in that, that's another one. But I do see that the time is up, so I thank you all for participating and coming out.